Hello and welcome to the LLG Grapevine podcast. You're listening to Helen Bennett, LLG's Executive Director of Policy and Governance, and welcome back to Dennis Hall, our LLG Bulletin Editor.
Thank you very much, Helen. Hi, everyone.
Now, last week, the LGA announced a major new public health improvement and support programme for English councils set to run for the next 3 years. And this will aim to strengthen local authority capacity in health delivery and prevention-focused services. And I understand that Essex County Council is looking to mount a legal challenge to the government's decision to reorganise the county into 5 unitary authorities. And that's according to the website Local Gov. It was dated the 26th of March. Whilst Welsh councils warn social care systems are far too stretched. But let's, as ever, turn our attention to the LLG Bulletin and our usual 6 topics of particular interest. Dennis.
Thank you, Helen. And we go straight into planning. And I should mention, by the way, there have been a lot of planning announcements over the last week, and we will catch up with those and cover some of the detail in our vlog in the next couple of weeks. But first, what's been happening this week? Chief Planner Joanna Averley has defended the government's decision to scrap the duty to cooperate from the plan-making system. Remember, Helen, you've covered this previously, some aspects of this, but there's been more on it because of the controversy that this decision has generated.
Yeah.
In a newsletter for planners, Averley said legislation had been laid to implement the new local plan-making system, adding that these changes confirmed the removal of the duty to cooperate. And she admitted the removal of the duty to cooperate had been questioned by those who feared the change would see weaker plans being adopted.
Yeah, but however, Averley did say that the government was committed to requiring more cross-boundary cooperation, and the Planning and Infrastructure Act, that was 2025, she said had created a new system of spatial development strategies, which we know, which will be used to distribute, she said, housing and other strategic planning needs for entire areas between local authorities.
And going on, she said, the advantage of having the cooperation requirement in policy rather than legislation is that deficiencies in applying it can potentially be rectified by the inspector during the examination, paving the way for more sites to be added and plans which otherwise may have failed to be adopted.
Well, she also said that the government are clear that these steps will cumulatively result in a planning system which is more positively aimed at delivering the housing and other development that's needed in a planned and predictable way. So the duty to cooperate will no longer apply in the new system, as housing need will in future be distributed. I can't talk this morning. Be distributed at the level of the SDS, and just to remind everyone, that's the Spatial Development Strategy.
Indeed, and this meant the only question had been whether to retain the duty for the remaining local plans going through the current system, which must be submitted by the end of 2026. Now, Averley said removing the duty also reflected updates in the National Planning Policy Framework to strengthen the section on maintaining effective cooperation, which had been carried forward in the draft updated NPPF.
Yeah, well, I think poor quality plans, I think the aim is that they'll be avoided because councils still have to plan on the basis of local housing need and consider accommodating the unmet needs of other neighbouring authorities. That's interesting, I think.
Yes.
Yeah. But let's stick with housing. So the government has updated its guidance on homelessness, a guide to the duty to refer. Now, this update was made on the 19th of March, and it introduced targeted procedural adjustments rather than major policy reform.
The Homelessness Reduction Act 2017 significantly reformed England's homelessness legislation by placing duties on local housing authorities to intervene at earlier stages to prevent homelessness in their areas and to provide homelessness services to all those who are eligible.
That's right. And additionally, the Act introduced a duty on specified public authorities to refer service users who they think may be homeless or threatened with homelessness to local authority homelessness or housing option teams. And the duty at that time was effective from the 1st of October 2018.
Now, this guide is primarily designed for professionals in public authorities that are subject to the duty to refer, although it will also be of interest to homelessness officials in local authorities.
Yes, so the guide outlines what the purpose of the duty to refer is. There's some advice for identifying when someone is threatened with homelessness and what the procedures are for referring someone to a local authority. And there's also some frequently asked questions in there as well.
Yeah. Now, according to the government's published update log, the following changes were made. First, uh, Section 5 of the guidance has been revised. The duty allows service users to choose which local housing authority they are referred to. When discussing the referral and offering guidance to the service user, it is important to be aware that if a person asks to be referred to an area that they do not have a local connection to, the local housing authority might subsequently refer them on to another local housing authority to which they do have a local connection.
Yes, and that has been the subject of some controversy actually,
Mm,
with people being sort of sent out
yes.
of where they feel that they belong and have a locus to. But just on that note, care it's important to recognise that care leavers, of course, have special provision which must be taken into account. Um, I think as well on a change, there's been the removal of local authority duty to refer email lists. Now, this email list previously included a list of local authorities um, uh, with email addresses. That's now been removed and it's been replaced by a link to the government's help from your council if you're homeless or at risk of homelessness. It's online tool. So there's now online tool. So it does seem to have
Mm,
moved forward a little bit rather than being given a
yeah,
list of emails. That is, of course, if you've got access to the internet. Um,
indeed.
so this tool is now the recommended route for locating the correct local authority contact.
Mm. Now, the update is operational, aimed at streamlining referrals and ensuring users are directed to the correct council via a centralized tool rather than simply static email lists. Now, no changes were made to the legislative duties, to the definition of homelessness, or to the list of public authorities subject to the duty.
I should imagine that that static email list fell out of date quite quickly.
Yeah, that's the
Um,
problem, isn't it?
So, council should update internal guidance, referral pathways, and training materials to better reflect the new mechanism and adopt the revised approach immediately. So, that's that. Now, in other news, we might finally be seeing some changes to statutory notices, Dennis.
Yeah, this has been on my mind for some time, Helen. It's something that's long overdue. You know, the councils are still putting notices on lampposts and statutory notices in
I
newspapers. And,
know.
with all the modern media that's available, this is something that is overdue for overhaul. And we're talking here about the government's plans to review the publication of statutory notices. The government is to review them and the rules around councils issuing statutory notices in local newspapers, and will launch a new regional media forum in the west of England aimed at improving reporting on local decision making. Now, the changes are part of a new local media strategy that the Department for Culture, Media and Sport is pursuing, and which also includes more funding for local news provision.
Well, I understand that the government have said its plans to conduct a review of the statutory requirements on local councils. It plans to do that to publish decisions on planning, road management, and alcohol licensing. Actually, in light of concerns over whether print newspapers are still an effective means of raising public awareness of this information.
Yeah, Helen, this is interesting, isn't it? Because not that many people read newspapers
No.
now. Most people's attention and focus is on social media. So this may be the kind of direction that they're going in. Because announcing the changes, the DCMS said, recognizing calls for greater digitalization, gosh, there's a word,
Yeah.
digitalization of statutory notice requirements, a public consultation will now be launched to understand how statutory notices can best work for communities and effective journalistic scrutiny. The government, meanwhile, said that the Regional Media Forum would explore ways to improve the relationship between journalists and local public services.
Do you know, Dennis, I seem to recall this was a bit of an issue during COVID. And I think there was
Yes, of
some
course.
waivers, but I can't. You'd think, wouldn't you, that they'd have moved a bit quicker with
Yeah,
some
you would have
time
thought it
away.
had been picked up before 2026.
Yeah. So, um, the government also said that the forum would aim to stimulate generation of public interest news and scrutiny of local decision making. And that's interesting. And we're going to come on in our vlog to look at governance and neighbourhood governance.
Hmm.
And that could galvanise more interaction. But local media outlets in print, online, radio, or TV will be able to bid for grants to support their financial sustainability and transition to online focused business models under a new multi-year what's called local news fund. And apparently that's going to be worth up to 12 million over the next 2 years.
Yes, this all looks promising, and Culture Secretary Lisa Nandy said the strategy was the start of a new approach to local media, adding, because local media was and always has been a ladder of opportunity to help new voices break into journalism, this is not just a nice to have. She said, it is essential to a cohesive country. Our debate is too narrow and too small. We will change that. The strategy which we publish today is the start, not the end point, and we recognise there is more to do.
Well, that's interesting. Let's
Yeah.
see. But let's take a turn back to housing now. It seems to dominate this edition because this is the housing offences sentencing
Mm.
guidelines consultation. This is important, actually. This is by the Ministry of Justice in what it calls its citizen space.
Yes. Now, this consultation asks for feedback on a new package of housing-related offences sentencing guidelines. These include two guidelines covering the 9 offences of unlawful eviction of occupier and unlawful harassment of occupier, and 4 guidelines covering offences related to houses in multiple occupation, commonly known as HMOs, and other housing standards offences. The package includes guidelines for individuals and guidelines for organisations.
Well, let's go back, between 2015 and 2024, so very nearly a decade, prosecutors, barristers, local authority enforcement teams, and officials from the former MHCLG, it's hard to keep up with the names, consistently raised concerns about the absence of clear sentencing guidelines for housing related offences.
And their message was unequivocal. Without consistent, structured sentencing, the system cannot effectively deter rogue landlords or protect vulnerable tenants.
No, that's right. And the Sentencing Council is now consulting on a package of draft guidelines that seeks to close this gap, strengthen enforcement, and increase confidence in the criminal justice approach to tackling housing offences.
At the centre of these calls for reform are offences in the private rented sector, particularly unlawful eviction, unlawful harassment, and breaches relating to houses in multiple occupation. But stakeholders highlighted two persistent issues.
Yes, they have. The first is that sentencing has often been low level, inconsistent, and divergent across magistrates and crown courts, leaving legal professionals without the predictability needed to advise clients and resulting in, frankly, uneven justice. And second, that some offences cause substantial harm, including tenants losing access to their home or belongings. And yet, courts have lacked guidance on how to reflect the seriousness of that impact.
Hmm. Now, although Ministry of Justice data suggests relative low numbers of unlawful eviction and harassment prosecutions, the charity sector paints a starkly different picture. Reports such as Cambridge House's Safer Renting Study indicate widespread illegal evictions that never reach prosecution.
Well, I think that's got to be right.
Hmm.
Um, and stakeholders suggest that inconsistent and often lenient sentencing outcomes are likely to be contributing to local authorities choosing civil penalties instead of criminal action, even where the offending is severe.
And this, it has been suggested, creates a cycle. Fewer prosecutions mean fewer opportunities for courts to build experience, particularly in cases where penalties could include unlimited fines or custodial sentences.
Well, stronger sentencing guidelines could help break this cycle. I think they would often signal that unlawful eviction and harassment offences, often accompanied, let's not forget, by intimidation, loss of possessions, or actually even
Mhm.
violence, do warrant proportionate non-financial penalties, such as community orders or, in fact, imprisonment in the worst cases.
Yeah. And this is especially important where landlords choose illegal eviction simply because it is cheaper than following lawful possession processes. As the Council's general guideline notes, it should not be cheaper to offend than to comply with the law.
Absolutely not. And alongside unlawful eviction and harassment, stakeholders also identified the need for clearer guidelines covering HMO related offences, including licensing breaches and overcrowding.
HMOs require landlords to meet essential standards, maintaining fire safety routes, ensuring that electrical and gas installations are safe, providing adequate amenities, and keeping common areas in good condition.
Years ago, Dennis, I had a HMO breach, decades ago, I had a HMO breach where there was no fire escape in the loft, and very
Mm,
sadly, the individual died in a fire. So it does go
shocking.
to show how incredibly important this is, especially when you consider the vulnerability of some of the
Yes,
occupants of these types of, yeah.
absolutely
So
shocking.
absolutely. So while some requirements vary locally, many are set nationally, and failures can pose significant risks. And yet, though, the overlap between license conditions and management regulations can make enforcement complex. So the proposed single HMO guideline aims to streamline this area by focusing on harm and culpability rather than administrative distinctions.
And additionally, wider housing standards offences, particularly those involving Category 1 hazards under the Housing Health and Safety Rating System, carry severe potential consequences for tenants' health and safety. Offences such as failing to comply with improvement notices or prohibition orders currently attract unlimited fines, but sentencing practice remains inconsistent.
Yeah, and it does. And in response to these issues, the Sentencing Council is now consulting on 6 new guidelines, 2 covering unlawful eviction and harassment, and 4 covering HMO and housing standards offences. And these guidelines aim to support more confident and consistent prosecution, as we've said, and help differentiate between civil and criminal enforcement routes and strengthen local authorities' ability to tackle non-compliant landlords.
Professionals across the sector are encouraged to contribute to the consultation, sharing insights on seriousness factors, appropriate penalties, and equality considerations.
Now, the consultation applies to England and Wales, and it's going to close on the 9th of April. Now, I know we covered that in some detail. I think it's really important. These are big changes coming down the line.
Indeed, they are.
Yeah, so I'm glad we discussed that. Now then, Dennis, it wouldn't be a podcast, of course, without mentioning governance.
Well, it wouldn't. And this is a report that I think we should spend some time looking at. So forgive me, this piece is slightly longer than the other ones. But governance issues are the most frequently reported challenge at councils that are subject to best value interventions. No surprise there, really. But this is what a new research report from the government and an independent think tank have said. The Lessons Learned report, authored by the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government and think tank Varian, took in data from 24 councils in England, made up of 11 with experience of statutory intervention and 13 with experience of non-statutory intervention.
Yes, so what it revealed was that while interventions delivered, quote, their intended improvements and outcomes and were generally regarded as successful, some councils complained about poor communication and lack of transparency from central government. And according to the report, the main drivers behind the failure of their best value duties are, surprise, surprise, here we go, governance, finance, leadership, which I think feeds into governance,
Yep.
culture, again, governance, local politics, and then some external factors.
The most frequently reported challenges were governance related, which were reported for 18 out of 24 councils, followed by financial 17 and leadership 16 challenges. There were 12 councils that faced cultural challenges and 8 that experienced local political challenges. Now, the report said that governance failures range from specific governance weaknesses to complete governance breakdowns, and in the most extreme cases, allegations of bribery and corruption.
Now, examples included a lack of process oversight, poorly defined officer roles, poor scrutiny, accountability and transparency in decision making was poor, and ineffective delegation. And in five councils, poor governance was associated with the disproportionate turnover of senior leadership roles. Now, we warned about this years ago as a
Yes.
pattern, um, which led to instability across the organisations, of course.
And the report added in two of these councils, the transition from a committee to a cabinet system was viewed as contributing to reduced levels of transparency and accountability, which in turn led to their best value failure. Elsewhere, the report said effective governance systems are vital for council performance. Weak internal structures, ineffective scrutiny, and defensive cultures reduce accountability and hinder problem identification. Going on, it said financial and audit systems are particularly vulnerable to governance weaknesses, often exacerbated by funding cuts. However, not all councils, they say, are facing similar environments and who face similar environments actually fail, suggesting
Mm.
that other factors influence best value failure.
Well, I think that's right. And five councils, meanwhile, reported that their entry into intervention was not communicated transparently or with sufficient notice. So, similarly, three councils with non statutory best value notices reported that they were unclear whether their notice would be lifted. Participants also called for greater transparency from MHCLG, that was. Um, on the basis for interventions, arguing that this would reduce the risk or perception that the process can or has been politicised. That's an important point.
It is, and it's been reported widely, this sense that you've mentioned there. And this has led to mistrust across local government of central government's intentions for interventions, according to participants, who also stated that MHCLG and other departments still have work to do to reset and improve the relationship. And reflecting on this, four councils reported that MHCLG did not transparently and sufficiently communicate the reasons for their best value intervention, while two stated the belief that the reason for their interventions was indeed politically influenced.
Well, despite the criticisms, I think the majority of those from the report who had experienced an intervention said that it was a positive experience, 17,
Hmm.
and six said it was too early to comment, while just one council reported a negative experience. And the report went on to make 11 recommendations, including that MHCLG updates its best value statutory guidance to clarify data sources used to monitor councils. I can understand why, because we're very
Yeah.
confused with absolutely. And review processes for recruiting and appointing best value
Yeah.
experts, again, important, and review roles and responsibilities of best value experts.
Yes, and I think there was a recommendation about how intervention, delivery, and progress are reviewed, and an assessment of the range and flexibility of intervention models. And finally, that the receipt of exceptional financial support uh, should not automatically preclude a council from exiting intervention, depending on the drivers of the financial support and its plan and progress.
Yeah, and it also recommended that the government continue to use political advisors with caution and collaborate with the local government sector to strengthen its intervention approach, amongst other recommendations. What it didn't do, and what I would have liked to have seen, Dennis, well, I think
Mm.
it touched on it very briefly, is it really emphasised the role of the monitoring officer in all this.
Yeah,
I'd
yeah.
like to have seen a bit more. I was slightly disappointed not to have seen more about that important
Yeah.
role.
And indeed of the what we now call the golden triangle relationships, the relationships
Absolutely.
of the statutory officers, and often at conference we hear of the vital importance of those relationships working at optimum performance.
That's right. Now then, for our final item, I want us to turn to the House of Commons, one of my favourite things, House of Commons library briefings. And this is on the intimidation of voters and candidates, and it was published on the 19th of March. So this examines the growing problem of intimidation in UK political life, both for candidates and voters. Um, the briefing provides an invaluable, I would say, overview for legal professionals engaged in public law, electoral law, criminal justice, or in fact, constitutional work.
Yes, the intimidation of political candidates, sitting MPs and voters is not just a social problem, it is, as you suggest, a legal one. It strikes at the heart of representative democracy by undermining free participation and the integrity of elections themselves. Now, the briefing pulls together evidence on how intimidation manifests itself, what protections already exist, and what legislative gaps still remain. Lawyers involved in public policy, electoral regulation, or criminal proceedings around harassment, threats, or undue influence will find this briefing particularly relevant.
Yeah, because it highlights several forms of intimidation faced by parliamentary candidates and sitting MPs, which obviously we can translate down for our local councillors, and this includes threats, harassment, often online, and conduct aimed at dissuading individuals from standing for office. And I think that's playing out. It covers both national and local elections, noting that online abuse has amplified the scale and visibility of intimidation. And I think for practitioners, this really raises questions around the adequacy of criminal
Mm,
offences, such as harassment, malicious communications, public order
yeah.
offences, when it comes to addressing this type of intimidation within a political context.
Yes, indeed. And the report also touches on voters' attitudes, including concerns around freedom of expression and the role of social media platforms. For lawyers, this intersects with regulatory debates about balancing free speech against harmful conduct and issues around Article 10 of the ECHR as well, which we've discussed before in this context.
Yeah, we have. And one of the critical legal tools examined in this brief is disqualification orders, which can prohibit individuals from standing for or holding public office, but only following certain offences. But the document, especially if you're new to it, explains the legal basis of those offences, how they operate, and when they can be applied.
The briefing also explores intimidation aimed directly at voters, and we've discussed that as well in the past. A long-standing electoral offence involving attempts to influence voting behaviour through threats or coercion. For legal professionals, this raises procedural questions around evidence gathering, prosecution thresholds, and the role of law enforcement at polling stations.
I would say that that's quite a difficult thing to
Mm.
evidence. For obvious reasons. But the briefing outlines the UK government proposals which are aimed at strengthening protections, including potential reforms emerging from the Speakers' Conference. And I think it underscores the challenges of applying traditional criminal statutes to, frankly, modern forms of intimidation, particularly online, and signals areas where legal reform may be needed. I just want to flag here the LGA survey, which we sent out. The LGA have, but it's available on our news channels, and it's on healthy debate and debating skills resources survey. So it's not focused on the Hate Not Debate campaign, but nevertheless feeds in and centres quite nicely around it. Responses are looked for officers throughout local authority, but also councillors. So if you do come across it, please forward it to your councillors within your local authority. And on that note, that's it for another edition of the podcast. You can read more on the items discussed today and many more besides by going to bulletin number 12, available on the LLG website now. So it's goodbye from me.
And from me too. Bye bye now.